Greetings again everyone, and today we'll be taking another of Nikon's new Z mount lenses for a spin, the Nikon Z 35mm f1.8s. I like it when manufacturers don't give their lenses huge long names. It is only for Nikon's new Z mount mirrorless cameras, full frame or APS-C, and it costs $850 or £700 here in the UK. Pretty steep really for a lens of this kind. Nikon don't seem very interested in pricing their equipment competitively. But that doesn't mean the lens won't have broad appeal, as 35mm on a full-frame camera is a pretty classic wide-angle focal length, but not such a wide angle that your subject is pushed away, and at f1.8 you can get some nicely out-of-focus backgrounds too, not to mention snappy shutter speeds. The lens does not feature image stabilization, but that's not a huge problem, as most of Nikon's newest cameras feature it built in. Well, let's take a look at build quality first. The lens's body is made of a mixture of metal and heavy-duty plastic, and accordingly it feels very high quality. It's a little large for a 35mm f1.8 optic, but at 350 grams, or just under a pound, it's not too heavy. The optics inside are made up of 11 glass elements, which is rather complex for a lens of this type, and goes some way to explain its size. It's based on a metal lens mount with a weather sealing gasket around the edge. Next comes the large metallic focus ring, which turns really smoothly, being nicely damped. It doesn't respond amazingly well to being controlled though, lagging behind being turned a little bit. Something positive though is that the lens exhibits almost no breathing at all when you change focus, as you can see here, which is useful for video makers. The lens's autofocus motor is silent and works reasonably quickly, although I have seen slightly quicker lenses than this before. Its accuracy was fine in my tests. The filter thread size is 62mm, and the lens comes with a decently sized, unremarkable plastic lens hood. It's not a very sexy looking thing in my opinion, but in fairness, that's hardly top of the list of priorities. Overall, the build quality is great. Well, let's take a look at image quality now. I'll start by testing it on a full frame camera, my 45MP Nikon Z7. Image corrections are turned on, except for diffraction correction. In the middle of the image, at f1.8, sharpness is impressively high, although not completely bitingly perfect. The image corners are a little bit soft. Do bear in mind though that a 45MP sensor is pretty demanding. Stop down to f2.8 and those corners see a lot more contrast and a little more sharpness, and the middle of the image goes from being great to perfectly sharp. f4 is the same in the middle, but the corners see another nice improvement in sharpness. The lens stays this sharp down to f11. Stop all the way down to f16 and some softness begins to set in due to the effects of diffraction. So overall, this lens is pretty sharp on such a demanding camera sensor. Its picture quality in the image corners may not be so amazing at wider apertures, but in fairness, it's still a little sharper than Canon and Sony's competing 35mm f1.8 lenses. Well, that is the full frame image quality. Let's test it in APS-C mode now. The Nikon Z7 has a 20MP APS-C mode, which is the same resolution as Nikon's only APS-C Z mount camera at the time of writing this review, the little Z50. So let's quickly see how well it performs. As before, at f1.8, the lens is very sharp in the middle, although not razor sharp. The corners are sharper than they were on full frame, I'm pleased to say, looking pretty good. Stop down to f2.8 and picture quality becomes essentially perfect from the corners and back into the middle of the image too, with excellent contrast. The lens stays this sharp down to f16, which, like in full frame mode, as you would guess, gets a little softer due to the effects of diffraction. So it's a slightly more convincing performance if you're shooting on APS-C. We are getting a real sweet spot advantage here, as the more difficult full frame corners are simply cropped out by the smaller sensor size. Well, let's move on and take a look at distortion and vignetting when you're shooting on full frame. These are images without any in-camera corrections. We can see the lens projecting a moderate barrel distortion here, and at f1.8 the corners are fairly dark, normal for a lens of this kind. Stop down to f2.8 and those corners brighten up a lot, and from f4 we see pretty even illumination across the whole image, so a pretty standard performance here. Keep your corrections turned on. Now let's see about close-up image quality. The lens can focus reasonably closely, down to 25 centimeters. At the closest distances, image quality is noticeably soft at f1.8, getting a little sharper at f2.8 and f4, but never quite reaching the same sharpness that we see at normal focal distances. How well does this lens work against bright light? Let's see. It's not great, really. There's only an average amount of flaring, but we see a little bit more glaring and reduced contrast than I would have hoped for. And while we're working in the dark, let's check out this lens's chroma levels. At f1.8, bright points of light in the corners of your images show only a tiny bit of chroma smearing. It remains at f2.8, but goes away at f4, so that's a reasonably good performance, really. As I mentioned before, this lens can give you nicely out-of-focus backgrounds. The quality of its bokeh is never too distracting, but also never particularly smooth. Its lines and highlights look a little heavy, I think. And related to bokeh is longitudinal chromatic aberration. At f1.8, out-of-focus highlights show quite a lot of colourful outlining. It's reduced at f2.8, and at f4 it's pretty much gone. Overall, the Nikon Z 35mm f1.8s is a good optic, but never so amazing that I would consider spending £700 on it. That is a lot of money. Remember, its maximum aperture is only f1.8, and its image quality shies away from perfection in a number of areas, and its images feel a bit like they lack a little character, but that's just my opinion. But still, there is no denying that it is very sharp and enjoyable to work with, and it's also pretty much your only option on Nikon Z right now for a lens of this kind, unless you want to try adapting other lenses on. Whatever question marks there might be over its value for money, its quality is still good enough to make it recommended.